of Africa, what's it got in terms of a competitive advantage? What has it got that's going for it that you can see in terms of the positives that we should be thinking about and focusing on?
Several leap out from my perspective as a journalist. One is obviously the youth and the potential, what we call the population dividend. The next 20 years, because of this enormous bulge. I mean, if we look at the Italian demographic pyramid, it kind of is inverted. So very, very few young people, a lot in the middle and quite a lot at the top, actually. African pyramid, especially when you get into Sahelian countries, it's sort of like this, you know, with almost no old people. And then at the bottom, just extraordinary. I mean, last week I was in Burundi, and I went to the villages up in the mountains, and you know, those villages where 65% of the village was 18 years old or under. 65% of the village. Now that's real. I mean, Uganda, I think, is pushing like 58-60% as a nation. That is a really positive thing if you can use it. That's obviously the key thing, you know. And Asia, obviously, a country like Thailand, Vietnam, especially Indonesia, even these countries managed to surf, as it were. They managed to surf the wave of their demographic bulge, you know. And now they've ended up at a point where they're much more prosperous. So that's number one. Number two, I think, is women. I think the one thing you get as a foreign correspondent traveling around in poor countries, especially in those countries which are destroyed and breaking apart, is the tremendous strength of women, and particularly in rural areas, how women just uphold the entire working fabric of a rural environment, and which I think is very important in the context of your agricultural discussions. And you know, women have not been acknowledged politically or economically in Africa, so that's a tremendous opportunity. To me, it's a sort of low-hanging fruit. I mean, if you can bring women, if you can get girls from the age of 12 and 18. You can get them into secondary school, you can get them into saving schemes, then I think that's got to have a revolutionary effect. Third thing, probably there is no, and we see this vividly here in Kenya with M-Pesa, it's just one example, where you don't have any vested interests, where you're starting from a poor base. Actually, some really innovative and quite elegant solutions are possible, which would not be possible, for example, in the United States. And I think the final point, which is, it's a kind of mushy point, but I think intellectually it's a really important point, is Africa, we know genetically, is the mother continent. And I just feel, I don't know what it means, but I know, I just feel inside that the fact that Africa has so much more genetic diversity and is so much more ancient than anywhere else, there must be a competitive advantage in that somewhere.
Do we have a balanced story around that in terms of some of the other things that we should be concerned about, we should be thinking about, and the things that are not so positive?
Obviously, I don't want to take up our evening talking about African leadership. That's something everybody in this room knows about. And we can ask questions about that, but I think that's a slightly redundant discussion. It's pretty simple. African leaders just have to get their act together, get beyond patronage politics, and start thinking about the common man on the street or in the village. But the one key area, I think, is urbanization, you know. What we see in the development sector, which is not to disparage the work that you're doing here for agriculture, but what we see is the there is maybe too much of an overemphasis on the rural environment and not enough on the urban environment. And you know, these cities which are like Nairobi, it's a city with 300,000 people. I mean, it was a city which was built for 300,000 people. Now we've got 3.5 million, pushing up to 4 million. Somehow, in that wonderful African kind of way, the dynamism, it kind of gets going. But the fixed cost of people being in traffic for 3 hours a day, that's really a competitive disadvantage for Africa. It's really difficult to see how an African economy will ever compete with an Asian or even a Middle Eastern economy unless they can urbanize correctly. And putting on my hat as a political correspondent, you know, in the slums, that's where you're going to have all the political risk, you know, for African countries. These are like Kinshasa, Kampala, Nairobi, Harare, wherever you go, Luanda. These cities, if you don't find jobs for young people, if you don't work out how to urbanize a city properly, then whatever you do out in the fields is going to count for nothing.
One of the really interesting conversations we've been having with the colleagues from the various different African country programs today is around that transition from when people stop thinking of themselves as farmers and thinking of themselves as business people whose business happens to be farming. Mm-hmm. And so it seems to me that actually part of that, the flip side of some of that stuff around urbanization is around actually how you make some of that, what seems quite unsexy really, the agricultural business. Actually, how do we make that more appealing and attractive and to young people? Is that a doable thing, or is this draw of urbanization inevitable, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think they do play into each other. We get into kind of quite complex issues about, I mean, which underlying everything is the question of whether Africa is an outlier, whether Africa is different from anything else that's gone before because of its disease burden, because it's happening later, because Africans who fail or whose societies fail, they have nowhere to go. It's not like Sweden had a famine in 1860s, Norway collapsed, Ireland collapsed. They had places to go, you know. But we know from biometric visas that there is nowhere for Africans to go. So there is that question which is outstanding, which is whether what has happened in other parts of the world will happen to Africa. But in the rural environment, and thinking about a low-carbon 22nd century future, I think one of the solutions for Africa is to think very innovatively about smaller settlements, so that not everybody is flooding in to large and decrepit cities, where they're forced into slums and their social capital is diminished and the political risk is increased. You know, with innovative new technologies, you know, hooking up villages, small communities, that may be doable, you know. I tend to think that's probably the only way to go, because I don't believe that the model we have in many African countries, including Kenya, is basically a copy of what South Korea and Singapore did in the 1970s. They want to be South Korea circa 1977. And they're not South Korea circa 1977. And so that, to me, that creating a consumerist future where you're going to somehow outcompete the Chinese, that's a non-starter, you know. So we really, I think in that sense, the rural Africa and agricultural Africa has a lot of potential and a lot of possibilities, but we haven't even begun to think out of the box on how to make that happen.